So, welcome to this evening's Madingley lecture. I'm Rebecca Lingwood, the Director of the Institute of Continuing Education here at Madingley Hall, and I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our chair for this evening, Professor Helen Cooper, so that she can then introduce our speaker, Professor Stephen Connor, and to chair questions at the end of the lecture. So Helen Cooper is Professor of Medieval and Renaissance Literature in the Faculty of English here at Cambridge. Her research interests include Anglo-Norman and Middle English romance, Chaucer and Shakespeare, and many other drama and romance. Helen was an undergraduate, research student and research fellow at Cambridge before being appointed as the first woman fellow at University College, Oxford in 1978. In 2004, Helen returned to Cambridge to a post originally created for C.S. Lewis. So, just before I hand over to Helen, could I remind you that if you have your mobile phones, now's the time to switch them to silent. So, thank you. Over to Helen.
Well, thank you for that, Rebecca. I should add perhaps that in addition to my academic post, I was chair of the English faculty at the time when we appointed Steve to the Grace II Chair of English Literature. These chairs attract a large number of applicants, as you can imagine. Cambridge is an attractive place to be. And when we saw Steve's application, my first thought was that this man must be a complete dilettante. He worked on so many things. I don't know if you've looked up his website, but they include not only the more predictable literary things like Dickens and Beckett and so on, but his books include a cultural history of ventriloquism, a study of the fly, one called The Book of Skin, and a philosophy of sport. When we started actually reading them, however, the first one I was impressed. The second one I was awestruck. And the third one I was ready to go down on my knees and worship at the sheer range and depth of his expertise over so many different areas. And so we were delighted to be able to appoint Steve to the Grace II Chair, and he's now coming to the end of his first year, and he has survived it despite everything we've done to him. And he is the most wonderful asset to the English faculty and to Cambridge more generally. And we're going to get some taste of just how good that is tonight. The subject he's chosen, quantum writing, literature and the world of numbers, is a taster of his next big project. And I've no idea what it's going to be about. And I'm quite sure that his previous publications and interests won't be an accurate indicator of what it's going to be about, any more than his work on ventriloquism predicted his work on sport. But I'm quite sure it will be interesting. So, Steve, thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Helen. It was worth coming just for that. I'll come out every week if I can have one of those. I suppose, actually, this might not have been predicted by ventriloquism or skin or air or the other things I've written about, but I suppose ending up with a job title that is the Grace II Professor of English, you might predict that there would be something mathematical in my preoccupations. When I first came, I was looking around for the Grace III, Grace IV and Grace V professors, not to mention the Grace I, but they all seem to have faded away or perhaps never to have been in existence. I'm going to talk about mathematics. There's going to be no equations and no formulae and no mathematics beyond basic differential calculus. It's a joke. It's a joke. And should you, for whatever reason, feel that you want to experience the whole thing all over again, well, the text of what I'm going to be saying, most of it is at that web address. You can even, if you like, I suppose, log on and sing along. But we'll see. We have lived for some time now under the dominion of number, a dominion that's likely only to be extended in the future. The world of numbers seems to have become more coextensive with the world as such, and for some time the worlds of art and literature have been represented through an increasingly piercing pathos of exception, their task seeming to be to secure the possibility of qualities amid and against quantity. Well, what I would like to do here is to try to illustrate and understand an opposite tendency in writing, the tendency to approach, if not actually to merge with, this newly mathematical world, and to draw writing closer to it rather than recoiling from it. As I've hinted, I'm not myself any kind of mathematician, though I have a touristic kind of interest in mathematical reasoning and some very elementary familiarity with some of the details of some areas of mathematics. But my actual mathematical competence is low, going on poor, nowhere near, for example, what might be required to scrape a pass at A-level. Some of the writers in whom I'm interested have considerably more mathematical expertise than that, Charles Dodgson, Lewis Carroll being an example. But mine here is not really an account of how this kind of mathematics might operate in literature. Rather, I would like to make out the workings of what we might call a kind of vernacular mathematics, by which I mean the ways in which mathematical assumptions, attitudes, and most particularly operations may be threaded through the work of writing and reading. This is perhaps akin to the kind of thing that philosophers, sometimes with a little taint of disparagement, refer to as folk psychology when trying to characterize the governing assumptions about such things as the nature of consciousness and intention that are entertained by ordinary people. I hope that I'll be employing this term, or if I employ this term, it's without that hint of condescension. In one respect, at least, my guiding assumption is precisely not that which prevails in folk attitudes, namely that mathematics is a mysterious, closed, esoteric, and inhuman world that, while not being of us, is somehow, because of the growing ubiquity of number and numbers, set over against us. We live in number, all of us, as much as we live in words, partly because what we mean by language is so intensely numerical. Now, this isn't to say that no changes have ever taken place with respect to the relations between words and numbers. There can be little doubt that many aspects of the modern world have been available by and for number. The Greeks, for example, had very few names for very large numbers, presumably because they couldn't think of any uses for them. The rise of merchant capitalism in the 16th and 17th century made accounting more and more important, and in many different areas people began to put numbers to things that had previously been outside the scope of quantity. In 1662, John Graunt analysed the bills of mortality in London to try to predict the onset of bubonic plague, but the real outcome of this was that the population of London was assessed accurately for the first time. It's a rather extraordinary thing for us to reflect that in 1662 there was no real way to know how many people lived in London. The estimates that John Graunt was able to correct were out by quite a long way. In 1700, the philosopher Leibniz used a similar method of extrapolation to inform Frederick, the Prince of Prussia, that he had many more subjects, nearly 2 million, than he thought, and should therefore not be shy of proclaiming himself king of a united Brandenburg Prussia. In 1798, Henry Cavendish performed the experiments and associated calculations that allowed him to determine the mass of the Earth. The rise of statistics in the 19th century produced what Ian Hacking has called an avalanche of numbers, an extraordinary epidemic of counting and estimating, not least, of course, in the measurement of epidemics themselves, which continues to expand today. We assume that we know and need to know the numerical values of things that had just not been evident or available to many peoples before. Galileo famously declared that mathematics was the language in which nature was written. But it would perhaps be truer to say today that mathematics is the language in which human nature, the social nature of human life, has been written. I will be evoking quite regularly a contrast between the quantitative and the qualitative repeatedly in what follows. And I hope you'll allow me the indulgence of sometimes proposing, in place of that rather titubant word quantitative, which I can hardly say, the word, rather more amicable word, quantical. Quantitative may suggest quantifiable or able to be rendered in terms of specific quantities. I'd like to actually appropriate the word quantical, which does have a now obsolete mathematical meaning, which I can't remember. I want to use this word quantical to imply the tendency or aspiration to render things in terms of quantity. A quantitative analysis deals with known or knowable quantities. A quantical attitude, in my usage, seeks to make out such relations. Quantical might be regarded then as the subjunctive mood of the quantitative, this slight unsteadiness of meaning assisted by its evocation perhaps of words like quizzical and nautical. Paradoxically, as social relations have come more and more to be expressed in number, representations of number itself have tended to stress their alienness, the alienness of numbers. Numbers have come to stand, especially in much modern writing, for the inhuman, the mechanical, the unconscious, the impersonal, the inert. W.H. Auden's poem Numbers and Faces articulates what might be called a humanist ideology of number. Now, I don't have much fondness for the word ideology, which I think is often just a way of describing somebody else's ideas in such a way as to represent them not as ideas at all, but as a kind of mental illness. But in this case, the systematic preference for the unsystematic that's expressed in an opposition to number does seem to make the term appropriate. Lovers of small numbers go benignly potty, believe all tales are 13 chapters long, have animal doubles, carry pentagrams, are Millerites, Baconians, flat earth men. Lovers of big numbers go horridly mad, would have the Swiss abolished, all of us well purged, somatotyped, baptized, taught baseball. They empty bars, spoil parties, run for Congress. Against the obsessive-compulsive wielders of number, either at the minor neurotic end or on a major despotic scale, there is the ultimate, for Auden, there is the ultimate unquantifiability of human relations signalled by the face. True, between faces almost any number might come in handy, and one is always real. But which could any face call good? For calling infinity a number does not make it one. The liberal view of quantification is expressed also by E.M. Forster in his novel Howard's End, in the person of Ernst Schlegel. It is the vice of a vulgar mind to be thrilled by bigness, to think that 1,000 square miles are 1,000 times more wonderful than 1 square mile, and that 1,000,000 square miles are almost the same as heaven. That is not imagination. No, it kills it. When their poets over here try to celebrate bigness, they are dead at once and naturally. Your poets too are dying. Your philosophers, your musicians, to whom Europe has listened for 200 years, gone. Gone with the little courts that nurtured them. Gone with Esterházy and Weimar. What? What's that? Your universities? Oh, yes, you have learned men who collect more facts than do the learned men of England. They collect facts and empires of facts. But which of them will rekindle the light within? I give you this quotation in order really to articulate the anti-numerical ideology or prejudice that perhaps begins to be articulated most forcefully in Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy of 1869. There, Arnold wrote of the tendency for socially reforming ideas to get swallowed up in bureaucracy. An English law is ruled by no clear idea about the citizen's claim and the state's duty, but has, in compensation, a mass of minute mechanical details about the number of members on a school committee, and how many shall be a quorum, and how they shall be summoned, and how often they shall meet. But in discerning what Arnold calls the intelligible law of things, and in offering the claim that literature should protect the particular, the anomalous, and the minute, such a criticism doesn't so much reject number as implicitly prefer small numbers to large, hence the elective minority that has characterized modern literary and cultural self-definitions. Matthew Arnold went on to declare in Culture and Anarchy, same place, "When we speak of ourselves as divided into barbarians, Philistines, and populace, we must be understood always to imply that within each of these classes there are a certain number of aliens, if we may so call them, persons who are mainly led not by their class spirit, but by a general humane spirit, by the love of human perfection, and that this number is capable of being diminished or augmented." So there is, even for Arnold, a kind of mathematics of culture. In many ways following Matthew Arnold, in his short pamphlet of 1930, I believe, Mass Civilization and Minority Culture, F.R. Lewis suggested that a reader who grew up with Wordsworth moved among a limited set of signals, so to speak. The variety was not overwhelming, so he was able to acquire discrimination as he went along. But the modern is exposed to a concourse of signals so bewildering in their variety and number that unless he is specifically gifted or specially favoured, he can hardly begin to discriminate. Here we have the plight of culture in general. The landmarks have shifted, multiplied, and crowded upon one another. The distinctions and dividing lines have blurred away. The boundaries are gone. It should not be too surprising, I think, in a book the title of which so openly endorses the principle of ratio in its critical reasoning, Mass Civilization, Minority Culture, to find an economic metaphor in its opening paragraphs. What Lewis calls the accepted valuations of a culture are, he says, a kind of paper currency based upon a very small proportion of gold. I think one of the ideas under negotiation in such formulations is that of the exact. On the one hand, mechanical efficiency is seen to depend upon a greater and greater mathematical exactness, which leaves no room, it seems, for the uncertain, the incomplete, or the incipient. Writers from Romanticism onwards frequently express a horror of a world that is exact and ticketed. Here, one thinks of all those halos and mists and hazes of which modernist writers, and one might add, modernist artists, have been so fond. At the same time, the mathematical exactness on which mechanical efficiency depends is itself often accused in modernist writing of creating blur itself by rounding complexity up into averages, estimates, and large numbers. In place of exactness on which mechanical efficiency depends, in place of the first, modernism proposes indefiniteness. in place of this latter, this blur of large numbers, modernism cleaves to the exactitude of the precisely innumerable. There could often be a rather sinister underside to this in the evocation of the numberless, in the imagination of the unnumberable mass, to be found in the nightmares of liberal intellectuals and anti-democrats alike, as has been laid out, I think, so tellingly in John Carey's book, The Intellectuals and the Masses. We might find this enacted, for example, in D.H. Lawrence's poem, his rather beastly poem, How Beastly the Bourgeois Is. Let him, I'll read you a little bit first before we get to that quotation. Let him, the bourgeois, meet a new emotion. Let him be faced with another man's need. Let him come home to a bit of moral difficulty. Let life face him with a new demand on his understanding. And then watch him go soggy, like a wet meringue. Watch him turn into a mess, either a fool or a bully. Lawrence's own reaction when faced with this new demand on his understanding is to enact his own kind of collapse into homicidal sogginess. How beastly the bourgeois is, standing in their thousands, these appearances in damp England. What a pity they can't all be kicked over like sickening toadstools and left to melt back swiftly into the soil of England. In Lawrence's poem, Let the Dead Bury Their Dead, the dead are said to exist in myriads, and not just because there are myriads of them, but because perhaps multiplicity is seen by Lawrence as death itself. The dead, in their seething minds, have phosphorescent, teeming white words of putrescent wisdom and sapience, mushrooms again, I think, that subtly stinks. Don't ever believe them. The dead are in myriads. They seem mighty. They make trains chuff, motorcars titter, ships lurch, mills grind on, and keep you in millions at the mills, sightless, pale slaves, pretending these are the mills of God. Numbers like thousands and millions become the very bearers of unimaginability. Here, the nescient hordes of the unimaginative are mathematically generalized into the unimaginable, enabling them to be swept away. Not that Lawrence was always opposed to number, provided that the numbers were small and precise enough, as becomes clear in his meditation on the patternings of a tortoise's body, in this poem from the volume Birds, Beasts and Flowers of 1923. It needed Pythagoras to see life playing with counters on the living back of the baby tortoise, life establishing the first eternal mathematical tablet, not in stone like the Judean Lord, or bronze, but in life-clouded, life-rosy tortoise shell, the first little mathematical gentleman, stepping, we might, in his loose trousers, under all the eternal dome of the mathematical law. Turn him on his back, the kicking little beetle, and there again, on his shell-tender, earth-touching belly, the long cleavage of division, upright of the eternal cross, and on either side, count 5. On each side, 2 above, on each side 2 below, the dark bar horizontal. The cross, it goes right through him, the sprottling insect, through his crosswise cloven psyche, through his fivefold complex nature. It's an almost medieval sense of the sacred symbolism of number that radiates from this poem. Something like Immanuel Kant's mathematical sublime haunts liberal authoritarian modernists like Lawrence. The sudden horrified sense that the world might indeed be full not just of indiscriminate spongy masses, but masses of individual minds. The preference for the small over the great, as we find it articulated, for example, in Virginia Woolf, goes along with a certain modernist desire for accumulation, for enlargement of scale and inclusiveness of number. Lily Briscoe thinks in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, one wanted 50 pairs of eyes to see with. 50 pairs of eyes were not enough to get around that one woman, Mrs. Ramsay, she thought. So in fact, we might say that modernism recoils not from number, but from large numbers into small numbers. Though modern literature and culture may try or may say that they're trying to get themselves on the other side of number, it's the very obsession with this anumerical project that makes modern writing, as we might say, quantical all the way through. And in actual fact, we might also say, I think, that the tendency both of mathematical reasoning and of the technical and engineering work based upon it in the last century or so is actually towards a sensitivity to the very small rather than the very large. Prompted by his discussion of the importance of aluminium in the period he characterized as that of neotechnics as opposed to paleotechnics, Lewis Mumford wrote in his book Techniques and Civilization of 1934 that the significance of minute quantities, which we shall note again in physiology and medicine, is characteristic of the entire metallurgy and techniques of the new phase. One might say, for dramatic emphasis, that paleotechniques regarded only the figures to the left of the decimal, whereas neotechnics is preoccupied with those to the right. Put in those terms, there then seems to be a kind of shared preoccupation between mathematics, physics, engineering, and literature and art in the 20th century, in the preoccupation with that which is to the right of the decimal point. We may make this out, this shift, even earlier, I think. 1900 saw the appearance of two works that, following the number magic of date coincidence, may be regarded as reciprocally illuminating. First of all, Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, which announced the method of psychoanalysis, a method which depended upon the isolation and amplification of tiny and seemingly insignificant phenomena of mental life. 1900 is also the year of Max Planck's formulation of the radiation law, which determined that the radiation emitted by a hypothetical black body, a theoretically perfect absorber and then emitter of radiant energy, must be emitted in discrete packets or quanta, each of them multiples of the value known thereafter as Planck's constant. Quantum physics is so called because it's built on Planck's discovery that the world is not completely continuous at the smallest scales. At these scales, physical actions cannot take an infinite, smoothly various number of values. Rather, they must be multiples of a particular quantity. It's as though the world turned out to be pixelated in some way at its core. The more you turn up the resolution, the more blocky or granular reality seems to be. And it's precisely this granularity that accounts for many of the disturbing features, and exciting features too, of quantum mechanics, in which particles are not permitted to move smoothly and continuously from one state to another, as at higher scales, which smooth out these spikes and jumps into continuous waves or lines, but rather must jump between levels or conditions. In both cases, in the case of the Freud and in the case of Planck's constant, large significance inheres in tiny variations detectable only by close and minute analysis. Both Freud and Planck announce a world in which, as Virginia Woolf was to say influentially in her essay Modern Fiction of 1921, we should not take it for granted that life exists more fully in what is commonly thought big than what is commonly thought small. In fact, modernist literature and criticism participates in what we may call a scale commutation, scale switching or scale conversion that's characteristic of modern science, whereby small local fluctuations may be amplified to have very large effects. Woolf is typical in the large, sometimes rather booming claims she tends to make in defense of the minute and the particular. The importance of the atom and of even smaller particles is not their smallness so much as their mathematical tractability, the fact that they moved, following the work of Maxwell, Boltzmann, Planck and others, from the realm of hypothesis into the realm of number and calculation. The sentence in modern fiction before the one I just a moment or so quoted, in which Woolf asks for an amplified attention to the small, enjoins, "Let us record the atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall. Let us trace the pattern." Woolf's writing, in fact, evokes the communication between the very large and the very small, and asks some of the same questions about the mathematics of the very small and the very large as mathematicians asked. Often, this involves reflection on the idea of vibrations, with the idea of which there had been a general intoxication in art and literature, as well as science, from the late 19th century onwards. Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway evokes the slight yet huge perturbation, for example, of a ministerial car driving up Bond Street. The car had gone, but it left a slight ripple which flowed through glove shops and hat shops and tailor shops on both sides of Bond Street. For 30 seconds, all heads were inclined the same way to the window, choosing a pair of gloves. Should they be to the elbow or above it? Lemon or pale grey? Ladies stopped. When the sentence was finished, something had happened. Something so trifling in single instances that no mathematical instrument, though capable of transmitting shocks in China, could register the vibration. Yet, in its fullness, rather formidable, and in its common appeal, emotional. For in all the hat shops and tailor shops, strangers looked at each other and thought of the dead, of the flag, of empire. So we're told here of a hypothetical instrument of infinitesimal sensitivity, not in order to discredit the notion of unconscious sensation, but in order to validate it by giving a plausible correlate in the physics of the very small. A similar kind of scale conversion occurs in the description of a First World War air raid on London in The Years, Woolf's novel of 1937. A gun boomed again. This time there was a bark in its boom. "Hampstead," said Nicholas. He took out his watch. The silence was profound. Nothing happened. Eleanor looked at the blocks of stone arched over their heads. She noticed a spider's web in one corner. Another gun boomed. A sigh of air rushed up with it. It was right on top of them this time. "The embankment," said Nicholas. Maggie put down her plate and went into the kitchen. There was profound silence. Nothing happened. Nicholas looked at his watch as if he were timing the guns. There was something queer about him, Eleanor thought. Medical? Priestly? He wore a seal that hung down from his watch chain. The number on the box opposite was 1397. She noticed everything. The Germans must be overhead now. She felt a curious heaviness on top of her head. 1, 2, 3, 4, she counted, looking up at the greenish-grey stone. Then there was a violent crack of sound, like the split of lightning in the sky. The spider's web oscillated. Modernist writing is characterized not by the eschewal of systems of calculation and enumeration, but the interest in the ways in which such systems could be converted into one another. The shock of the bomb blast and the quiver of the spider's web. This accounts for the interest in counting to be found throughout the work of writers like Joyce, Beckett, Lawrence Wolfe and May Sinclair and many others. And I'm spending my spare moments when I'm not marking exam scripts counting up the episodes of counting to be found in modernist writing. Like many other modernists who devoted themselves to the making out of other kinds of rhythms than those measured by the clock, Wolfe is closely attuned to the work of Henri Bergson, whose doctoral dissertation, published in English as Time and Free Will in 1910, offers a critique of the idea that sensations have anything at all to do with number. Sensations are registered in terms of variable intensity in time, says Bergson, while number relates, he says, to extension, that is, to magnitudes juxtaposed in space. And yet, in a curious way, Bergson, so influential on modernist writers, depends upon a kind of fixated mathematical space. In fact, mathematical space, the space described by mathematical relations, is far more complex and dynamic and changeable, indeed temporal, than Bergson gives it credit for. It seems that for Bergson and those who follow him, and they were many, mathematics can only play its part in a critique of reductiveness if it has itself first been plausibly but brutally reduced. But I think there's an even more important bridge between mathematics and writing than the concern with the very big and the very small, in the modernist concern with questions of order. Modernism can be regarded, in large terms, as the attempt to find a quasi-mathematical reduction of the formless and bewildering chaos of modern life into something that was called, for example, in Roger Fry's formulation, significant form. But modernism involves more than just this reduction or simplification of the complex, for modernist texts, on the other hand, also sought to transmit and even to intensify this vibrant disorder of modern life. We can say, putting it in terms to which I'll return at the end of my talk, that artistic modernism comes about in the transaction between pure energy and form or information. And one of the ways in which this becomes manifest is in the interest that modernism inherited from the 19th century in the nonsensical. G.K. Chesterton wrote in 1902 a defence of nonsense, in which he made out, in the nonsense of Victorian writers like Edward Lear and Lewis Carroll, the idea of escape into a world where things are not fixed horribly in an eternal appropriateness, where apples grow on pear trees, and any odd man you meet may have 3 legs. Lewis Carroll's Wonderland, he observes, is populated by insane mathematicians. Chesterton proposed that if nonsense is really to be the literature of the future, it must have its own version of the cosmos to offer. The world must not only be the tragic, romantic, and religious, it must be nonsensical also. And for Chesterton, that nonsensical reality or nonsensical cosmos would be one that would move through number into a kind of disorder. Somewhat more explicitly, in a remarkable book of 1952, Elizabeth Sewell, her book The Field of Nonsense, proposes that nonsense is governed by a rather rigorously mathematical principle of reduction or finitude. First, in order to create nonsense, she says, the world must be reduced brutally to units. Numbers are interchangeable because they are all, by definition, commensurable, being commensuration itself. But this means that numbers are also reversible. Numbers exist in an order, the order of what are called the ordinals. But a numerical consciousness also allows a reordering of numerical order. Something of this attitude is, I think, apparent at many moments in Lewis Carroll's writing, such as this from Alice in Wonderland. "What do you know about this business?" the king said to Alice. "Nothing," said Alice. "Nothing whatever?" persisted the king. Nothing whatever, said Alice. That's very important, the king said, turning to the jury. They were just beginning to write this down on their slates when the White Rabbit interrupted. Unimportant, Your Majesty means, of course, he said in a very respectful tone, but frowning and making faces at him as he spoke. Unimportant, of course, I meant, the king hastily said, and went on to himself in an undertone. Important, unimportant, unimportant, important, as if he were trying which word sounded best. These are commutations between questions of value enacted in words, but I think with the resources of reversibility that are made available by number. And in fact, I think an entire study might be written of the imagination of reversibility that begins to preoccupy writers and artists and thinkers and technologists from the middle of the 19th century onwards, encouraged in very large part by the invention of technologies that precisely allowed you to run things backwards, like phonography, sound recording, and cinema, of course. There is a more general sense of order, in the sense not of succession, but of pattern, which is also salient in modernist literature, which likes to put itself on the side of unpredictability and cognitive dishevelment as against exactness, finitude, and orderliness. Take, for example, this interchange between Sissy Jupe and Louisa Gradgrind in Dickens's Hard Times, which can be read almost as a manifesto for the work of the imagination against calculative reason. Then Mr. McChoakumchild said he would try me once more, and he said, "Here are the stutterings." "Statistics," said Louisa. "Oh, yes, Miss Louisa, they always remind me of stutterings, and that's another of my mistakes." Well, the joke is a nice one, and a simple one, and easy to understand, even if you subject it to structuralist analysis, like the following from 1985. The joke involves, of course, the opposition between the ideas of efficiency and inefficiency in language. The word stutterings is obviously, in one sense, mere noise, whose only meaning consists in representing Sissy's difficulty in pronouncing the word statistics. But, of course, the joke consists in the happy accident that stutterings is not just a meaningless mistake. The word that Sissy hits upon does have meaning in that it is an implied judgment on the inefficiency of statistics themselves. Useless as they are for the measurement and understanding of the subtleties of human feeling, statistics really are just stutterings. This brings about an inversion in the sign. The inefficient metonymy becomes an efficient, meaningful metaphor, while the metaphor, statistics, becomes mere sound, as inefficient as we've taken Sissy's mistake to be. Indeed, the author of this, who happens to have been me, even added to these earnest sentences a diagram, which was de rigueur for jobbing structuralists of my stripe at this time. I've been haunted ever since by the fact that the diagram was in fact printed wrongly and was thus infiltrated by the lurking possibility of error that it aimed to map, so much so that I couldn't even bring myself to make a slide of the mistaken diagram. So let me try to repair my error, even at the potential cost of repeating it. The fact that statistics sounds a bit like stuttering seems to license or let slip the disrespectful thought that statistics may be no more than a kind of stuttering, rather than the serene and secure knowledge of the states or stable conditions of things to which it or they seems to pretend. That's what statistics means, the states of things. Stuttering subjects statistics to blurring deformation. The pompous self-assurance of statistical reasoning is therefore cut down to size, the whole joke being echoed or anticipated in miniature in the name of Sissy's teacher, McChoakumchild, which seems to be fissured by just the same kind of hiccup, so that the one who would wish to choke the child has a name that chokes him in its enunciation. Well, this was the particular kind of law I was trying to lay down with the authoritarian assurance of the young in my Tyro reading. But it now seems to me that there is a different and much more interesting kind of stutter in the mechanism of the joke. For while statistics may present themselves, itself, I don't know, as static, and to do with the invariant states of things, the whole point of the statistical reasoning of the 19th century was precisely to allow an accounting for error. This is why the central artifact of 19th century statistics is in fact often called the error curve, that bell-shaped curve of what's also called the normal distribution. The joke works at the expense of the idea of statistics. I'll give it to you again, in case you've forgotten it. But it can, in fact, only work because of what must be thought of as a kind of statistical operation. For we recognize the word stutter as a near relation of and a plausible substitution for statistics because of the statistical principle that makes the comprehension of language possible, namely that we don't have to hear or see exactly the same sounds or word shapes intended in speech and writing, since we're always able to infer what they are by probability. This probability is governed by the degree of what is known as redundancy in the surrounding utterance, or in the language as a whole. There are plenty of indications in the surrounding context that the word that Sissy is looking for ought to be statistics, even though that's not the one she uses. And the joke entirely depends upon the fact that we understand, we kind of unconsciously calculate this high probability. Indeed, though statistics is thought of as a mechanical operation, the subtlety of the calculations and inferences that linguistic creatures like we are spontaneously effect, with both written and spoken signs, provides on the internet, and you'll all be familiar with this, the most effective way of discriminating humans and machines by means of the devices known as captures. You know, those little kind of strange scrawls that we can make out and that it's assumed robots cannot, because we are very good at unconscious statistical reasoning in reading words or in hearing words. So Dickens sets human imprecision against the inhuman precision of statistics, but only statistical precision, the particular kind of pinning down in and of imprecision, allows the joke to work. Phew. Actually, I want to suggest that there may be a quantical element in all comedy, not just that which involves nonsense. Immanuel Kant, no less, defines the comic in terms of a variation of quantities. He does it, in fact, and somewhat unexpectedly, by telling a joke. I think it's the only joke in Immanuel Kant. Perhaps you know another, but here is the joke. An Indian at an Englishman's table in Surat saw a bottle of ale opened, and all the beer turned into froth and flowing out. The repeated exclamations of the Indian showed his great astonishment. "What's so wonderful in that?" asked the Englishman. "Oh, I'm not surprised myself at the Indian at its getting out, but at how you ever managed to get it all in." Doesn't always get a laugh, that joke, but it amused Immanuel Kant. The important principle here is of a certain blind or mechanical play between pure levels or quantities. Laughter is a kind of positive something formed out of the sudden reduction of something into nothing. Rather conveniently, the content of the joke, it's about bubbles or foam, provides Kant with his metaphor for discussing it. It is not, he says, because we think ourselves more quick-witted than this ignorant Indian. It is rather that the bubble of our expectation was extended to the full and suddenly went off into nothing. Comedy, it seems, comes from the friction of different quantities, or perhaps rather the abrasion of the quantical and the qualitative. So perhaps the affinity between number and comedy is due not only to the fact that comedy always involves a certain play with number, it's also due to the fact that comedy involves a play between the orders of the quantical and the qualitative. Maybe even play itself must always have something mathematical about it. There's no play without things. Children without things to play with are bereft, at a loss. But also no play without the play between things and the non-things that things in play can be or must be turned into. And there is nothing that enacts this play more than the particular kind of now you see it, now you don't thing that a number is. And there is one particular number of which this is most particularly true, and that is the number naught, or the number nothing. The nothing that Alice articulates, echoing perhaps King Lear's Cordelia. The nothing that is prodigiously a something in its effects. The nothing that is both a number in the number series, and yet actually, of course, as we know, only for a relatively short time in Western mathematics, as naught featured in the number series, and yet is also a kind of exception to the whole realm of number itself, because nothing, or naught, is in a sense the absence or negative of number entirely. Where I want to end is with the suggestion that modernist writing about and with and impelled by and threaded through with number helps us to understand that mathematics may be more than just one thing, that there is a kind of multiplicity of mathematical forms and effects, that we must do better than reducing mathematics to this rather grimly one thing. We must resist what the philosopher Alain Badiou, who's put together an entire kind of political philosophy on mathematical set theory, we must resist the principle of the count for one, or the rounding up of diversity into oneness when applied to the domain of mathematics itself. Mathematics becomes more and more operative in the world precisely because its forms and uses massively multiply. Mathematics doesn't underwrite the world, but rather is ever more variously written through it, sometimes, often maybe, with the assistance of literary writing. Far from being driven into a condition of ever more ignorant and ignominious minority, I think literary writing is an important part of this expansion and diversification. There may no more be an essential being of mathematics, one essential thing that mathematics is or does, than there is an essential or invariant being of language. We should learn to apply a subtler mathematics than that of the one thing or another to mathematics itself. Mathematics is just as much a twisted rope as language, not least because it is so twisted together with language. Thank you.
Well, I told you you were in for a treat, and we've certainly had it. That was fantastic. But Professor Connor has agreed to answer questions too.
So just a comment and then a question, if I could. I used to write comedy scripts years ago with an applied mathematician. I saw that he'd written several books, and I realized I couldn't understand a word of any of them. And it made me realize he could do what I could do, but I couldn't do what he could do. So you made me think about that, really. But, okay, my question is really, you've said a lot about modernism, but I think, to me, there's a certain tension between literature and numbers, and I'm thinking about the First World War and the First World War poets, and the idea of the sheer mass death,
Yes.
and then the creation of poetry around single experience. And also, if you think about Mrs. Dalloway and that terrible characterization of Septimus Smith, the soldier who, in a sense, is living dead in urban London, and what that means. It seems to me there's a kind of trying to get something of a writer coming to terms with that experience of mass death in a single figure. And I just wonder if you could say something about that.
Yes, and of course, you know, that has been the experience of war, of mass death that is, as we say it, unimaginable. And it's precisely that that kind of struggle, which for the war poets is a, is a moral struggle and a political struggle, but also an intensely literary struggle. What kind of language is available to conjure this experience? That oddly, though it may express itself in a revulsion from just the pure kind of inhuman insanity of these massive numbers, it's that I think kind of brings writing close to something like a mathematical enterprise. But remember that I don't think that mathematics is one thing. So that means I don't think I'm committed, I hope I'm not committed to saying that at some deep level there is one thread that ties them together. Actually, it's a whole series of quite complicated overlaps, which no doubt, there could be a rather a fancy mathematical description of. But I think it's an excellent example, really. I mean, it's the first moment at which the demand of imagining the mass, not just the kind of latent mass of lots and lots of people just like you who are in principle participating in your life, but a mass that is in some sense, you are deeply participating in, if only because of, the extraordinary terror of that experience. And one that, of course, is not, doesn't stay in its place. Hence, that description of First World War air raids. We don't think of there being air raids in London in the First World War. There were. It begins that massification of war, such that war in the 20th century, at least on 2 occasions, but not, thank God, since 1945, has been on a kind of scale that seems to leave no outside, no other place. So I think you're right, it's absolutely the testing ground for imagination and a kind of moral mathematics.
Now, from what you've said today in your lecture this evening, the way I've interpreted it is that what you're talking about, and you know what you talk about when I don't, but what you're talking about is aesthetic maths. Because in actual fact, I can't see how you can write without being mathematical. Because if you think about it, our language has got, well, if you break up into syllables and that, and rhythm, and every language has rhythm, and rhythm must include maths, otherwise we wouldn't have rhythm. Then what we've got in these, in your examples, is a more aesthetic maths, rather than the literary maths, or the maths that I learned at school, but I was useless at. And the point is that you said there's, so you're I'm guessing, I might have got this all wrong, but what you're talking about is embracing maths as this widest possible concept. Precisely. Is that right?
Precisely, 10 out of 10. Precisely, and actually, of course, it would be silly to pretend that modernist writers are the first people to have a sense of the, the quantitative dimensions of language, because what was called numbers referred for centuries to prosody, to rhythm in poetic writing. Knowing numbers was knowing the beat, was knowing the count, by means of that music as the kind of mediator between them. James Joyce coins the word muse mathematics in one of the chapters of his novel Ulysses. So yes, I suppose that was the sort of thing I was getting at when I think used the phrase vernacular mathematics or folk mathematics, or one might say implicit or even instinctive mathematics. Although I would want to say as well that, human beings have to learn this. None of us knows how to write. All of us, it's pretty hard to stop human beings speaking as long as there are other speaking human beings around them. But no human being spontaneously writes. And although there is a certain amount of spontaneous mathematics, what we have spontaneously mathematically, we pretty much share with pigeons. Human beings can see, without having to count them, 4 or in some cases 5 things. That may be why dice have 5 or 6 faces. That it would actually be very hard for us to see 7, but pigeons can do that. Beyond that, we really have to grow a new cognitive apparatus. But then that's what we are. That's what human beings do. And one of the ways we grow this apparatus is precisely through language. And another way is through forms of calculation. And of course, you know, I wouldn't want to claim that the two are for the first time intertwined. One might want to say, actually, that before you have elaborate mathematical notation that seems to draw mathematics away from language, you know, when you're trying to do calculations with words or letters, as the Romans were, you know, language and mathematics are even more intertwined. But, you know, there are still, well, I don't know if there are still people in the world, but there used to be people. Freud was very impressed by this, and so was George Eliot, who really only have three numbers: 1, 2, and loads. You know, I don't think there are any human beings that don't have the concept of 2, but there are quite a few that don't have the concept of 3 as opposed to 4, or have been.
You talked about how, the gentleman over there talked about how mathematics is a language in itself that is increasingly nonsensical, the more complex the maths gets. So with this divide between the language that I'm speaking and the language in a mathematics book, do you think that literature will become more mathematical? And further to that, you talked about how in the mid-19th century, mechanization created a sort of backwards, not backwards in one sense, but a backwards way of thinking. Do you think that technology now might influence the way that we make maths out of literature?
Well, there it is. That's numbers. You know, that's a digital image. It's formed of digits. It's formed of, you know, invariant numbers, just patternings of ones and noughts. So in a certain sense, we're already there. There is a certain level at which we acknowledge, you know, we need to arrange the jumps or communications between the scales, but there's a certain scale at which we acknowledge that our world of literature is numerical through and through. And the remarkable thing about that is how the kinds of ways, it seems to me the sort of elective affinity that there is between a digital text that we're able to move backwards and forwards between, that we're able to construe in highly patterned ways that you never could just listening to an ordinary utterance unfolding in time. We're able to do that with the digital text, but that's the kind of thing that literature has encouraged us to do from the beginning. You know, to move back and forth. It's a version of important, unimportant. You know, it takes us off that blind, onward, linear flow of things, which is that of life, and into something more complex, but also more structured. And this is what information theorists mean by this rather wonderful word and strange word, redundancy. You know, any form of patterning within an otherwise complex system is a way for the system to kind of form a pattern and to become aware of itself as a system. And, you know, that's as true of the Divine Comedy as it is of Finnegan's Wake.
I'm quite interested in how you began your talk with the fear of large numbers. And I wondered if I might ask a slightly frivolous question and ask your advice. I'm an astrophysicist, and therefore I wondered if you could offer any advice as to how I might communicate and dispel this myth and fear of large numbers.
Well, I mean, in a certain sense, your work is being done with it. I mean, you know, there are certain areas where we have no sensitivity at all, like probabilities. You know, somebody says, you've got a 1 in, whatever it is, 10 squillion chance of winning the lottery. And people think, well, could be me, you know. And they are, of course, right, and there's no particular reason why it shouldn't be you now rather than you in 15,000 years' time, which is, you know, probably how long it would take you to win the lottery. So in a certain sense, I think we are already, of necessity, generating a certain kind of feel for these things. I think probability is precisely the area where we're having to develop a kind of an organ or an instinct for comparing the infinitesimal with the very large. Though, as I say, none of us are particularly good at it. But I often remember at times like this, I used to have a colleague who was a physicist, a theoretical physicist, so it's kind of, you know, back of the envelope stuff. I don't know what kind you do. Perhaps you do expensive experiments. But he was a very cheap physicist. He used to do a lot of calculations and dreaming and speculation, and he was very interested in the relations between physics and modern culture. And I used often to go to him and say, well, look, I'm reading this bit of James Joyce or this bit of Samuel Beckett, and, you know, to what might they have been reacting? And he said, well, one day he said, Steve, why do you always ask it that way round? Why don't you think that physicists might have generated certain kinds of mathematical cognitive apparatus as a result of listening to very strange music or looking at very bizarre paintings? You know, in a certain sense, maybe there is a sort of shared pool of resources for taking in alienness and difficulty and making a certain kind of limited sense of it. At least that's what I hope. So maybe there are some resources for you know, the imagining, the building of the bits of mental apparatus required to get us in some sense to line up with this new other world of numbers.
Well, that's an absolutely fascinating thought to end on, and we can all perhaps start going out and looking for the bizarre and the irrational that might generate new forms of mathematical cognition. Thank you. It's been wonderful. It's made us think rather than just what we've learned. And it's made me think enough thoughts to last me for a good many months to come, I think. I have the great advantage of being able to nobble Steve over the English faculty kettle from time to time and go on asking him questions. Sadly, we can't all do that, and he might retreat back to London if we did all try. But it's been a wonderful hour. Thank you very much indeed. And let's thank him again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Helen, for chairing so ably. And of course, thank you, Steve, for a really fantastic and stimulating lecture this evening. As just a small token of our appreciation, I have a gift for you, which is a guide of Madingley Hall and the gardens and some of the history, which you can read at your leisure and find the mathematics hidden in there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Rebecca.
And thank you, Helen. So, thank you all for coming, and of course, to extend the thanks to my colleagues for whom, without whom, evenings such as this wouldn't be possible. As ever, I'd really like to invite you all back here to Madingley Hall in future, whether that be to study with us. You all have brochures on your chairs, so please do take them away with you, and there are more on the gallery as well. Or perhaps back for a future Madingley lecture or for a Madingley concert. Our next Madingley lecture, which isn't quite up on our website yet, but will be in the autumn, will be given by Professor Alison Sinclair, who's Professor of Modern Spanish Literature and Intellectual History, and she'll be talking on the theme of crime and punishment and various forms of wrongdoing, so it sounds intriguing. So you'll be very welcome to join us then. So it only remains for me to wish you a good evening. If you are leaving us at this point, then please do feel free to enjoy the late evening sunshine and explore the gardens. If you have an invite to stay back with us, then we'll be gathering here. So thank you and welcome back in future.